The Anunnaki. Few subjects are more controversial. Few subjects spawn more speculation than the study, the talk of the Anunnaki. And I know it's probably surprising to some of you to see me even talking about the Anunnaki, because I usually don't do the whole Anunnaki thing. I don't usually go down that path, but it has been kind of foisted upon me with some of the work that Jay Campbell and I have been doing. And now that we're going to have the leader of the, or the spokesperson, I should say, of the Great White Brotherhood on, I thought it was important to talk about this, as Ronnie and A Comfort and Yako and Johnny Ringo just walked over your grave. Scott Severini, Mark Trujillo, Jennifer Devane, Billy McNally, Mary Lutz, Beth Nice. Nice to see all of you in the chat room. And I came across, at Jay's behest, a book called The Reign of the Anunnaki, Lake Worth Monster for Peg. April, nice to see you. Charlene Rue, Melanie Webster, Dolores Stillwagon. Little bit. So nice to see all of you. And this book I really like because it is an objective presentation, I think, of Anunnaki lore and information. And let's see, Joelle, Rhonda, late for lunch. OMG, it's Moses, Billy McAnally. It's very, I think, Brian Westlake, it's very objective. And I want to give you, as this series is entitled, Seth 1111, a Anunnaki A to Z. And trying to give it to you, Francis Smith and Joseph Macayone, Humanoid Unknown. Try to bring you as most objective information as I can, Ask Lucid, to talk to you all about this thing. And I really like this book because I think it's got some great information, some great knowledge, and it also does some good talk about these guys. Thank you, Derek. Derek has given me appreciation of my haircut. I really do appreciate that. So the Anunnaki came to us from ancient Mesopotamian writings. And of course, they are talked about in esotericism. That's who we are. We're esoterics. They're also talked about in fringe science. And as I'm increasingly becoming aware, the Anunnaki are being talked about in also New World Order and political global issues, as many people speculate whether or not the Anunnaki are the group that binds together and empowers and maybe makes up the population of some of the controlling entities. And of course, the whole subject of the Anunnaki gained its real following and its real impact on social and political culture with the books of Zecharia Sitchin, who lived from 1990 to 2010. And he set forth the theory, of course, that the Anunnaki are visitors to Earth from a planet named Nibiru. Hi, Kimber Kiss and 33D3D, Think Agape Love, Dufour Skywalker. And I read all of Sitchin's books. Power Vapor Supply. I read all of Sitchin's books. I still have Sitchin's books. And I'm really on the fence with Sitchin, Unicus Light, Scott Severini. I think Sitchin brought some good information. I think Sitchin brought some not so good information. So he's about 50-50, half and half, some good stuff, and I would say some not so good stuff. Hi, Joelle. But of course, Sitchin is the guy that kind of got the whole ball rolling with the Anunnaki. And then Michael Tellinger, with his book, Slave Species of the Gods, he kind of picked up, if you will, where Sitchin left off. And some of the criticisms of Tellinger's work is that he relied too heavily and he gave almost intellectual carte blanche to the writings of Sitchin, especially the book, The Lost Book of Enki, which I have read as well. So people wonder how, hi, Lynn McGraw and Vanessa. People wonder how objective Tellinger was. And of course, one of the big takeaways from Tellinger's writings is he says that Jesus and the Christ are agents of the Anunnaki. And that's, of course, very, very interesting to those of you that are followers of the Christ, to those of us that believe in the Christ message. By the way, the author of this book says, no, that's not true. But I think that we need to study and look and take into account all types and all different takes on the situation. Vanessa, Tim Klein, Matt Burkett, Ask Lucid. So here we are talking about this, and here we are looking at this through our series on this. The author of this book believes that Jesus was a messenger of Christ, and that he had the mission of informing us about the rule of the Anunnaki, and that was why he was allegedly killed. And this mission was carried on by the Gnostic Christians until they too were eliminated by the ruling powers. Now that's interesting, because many times, I am 9, the message of the Christ does appear to be showing us the presence of malevolent beings trying to build a fear and guilt control matrix that are trying to keep us under their thumbs. And one could say that the Christ did come, at least in part, to tell us about the Anunnaki, to warn us about the Anunnaki. But the people that say, like Tellinger, that Jesus and the Christ are agents of the Anunnaki, they might be right too. Now, somebody says, Jeff, how could one person be right and say that the Christ was trying to warn us about the Anunnaki, and another person be right and say that Jesus and the Christ were agents of the Anunnaki? Well, my friend, Magenta Pixie, has advocated in her books what I think is a very powerful exercise. I think she calls it mental plasticity, or if she doesn't, I call it that. And what that does, and what that advises us to do, as I have a nice cup of coffee, is to be able to simultaneously entertain opposing opinions within our mind in order to not close ourselves off to any possibilities, and to be able to open ourselves to more flow of information and energy and spirituality. Billy McNally getting a little bit impatient. So did the Anunnaki make us or not? Well, we'll get to that. That's what we're talking about. But it is highly possible, let's just say, that plastic Jesus could have been, and most likely was, as Global Witness says right on cue, an agent of the Anunnaki. Plastic Jesus, I have no problem believing that he was an agent of the Anunnaki. And the Christ was a messenger to tell us about and to warn us about the Anunnaki. So both can still be right. And OMG, as Moses says that Jesus was put here for entertainment, I would say yes and no, and yes and no. It certainly has brought a lot of entertainment. Mel Brooks and Jesus Christ Superstar and all this. Plastic Jesus was definitely put here for entertainment. And I find even the words of the Christ, the Master, entertaining at times as well. So both could be true. Hello, Timothy Buddha, finally making it to a live show. Jay Hedrick, nice to see you here. And if I missed you, oh, Alfred, I see you sneak in. Victoria Cunningham, if I missed you, it doesn't mean that I don't like you. It just means that I've missed you. So I think it's important to keep our mind open to multiple possibilities. And then last but not least, you know, Scott says there's 2 sides to everything. There's actually 3 sides to everything. His side, her side, and what really happened. Your side, my side, and what really happened. But there's also a German author, French-German author named Anton Parks, and he published books in French, of which one, I'm not even going to try to say the French, is The Truth About Our Origins. And Parks translates the Mesopotamian text quite differently from previous linguists and ethnologists. So you've got a lot of attention being paid to the Anunnaki. You've got the works of Sitchin. You got the works of Tellinger, which for the most part support the works of Sitchin and advance the belief that the Christ and Jesus were agents of Henley Vision, Heather Cooper, David Hall, agents of the Anunnaki. And of course, this author, Jan Erik Sigdal, that suggests that no, the Christ came to tell us about and warn us about the Anunnaki. Hello, Brian Parker, for checking in. Mark Trujillo for checking in. So who are the Anunnaki? And of all the stuff I've heard about the Anunnaki, and of all of the speculation I've heard about the Anunnaki, and, oh my OMG, it's Moses is asking if Jesus and Thoth were sons of Enki. Were they Enki? Were they sons of Enki? I don't know. We'll get to that. Great questions. But of all the stuff that I've heard about the Anunnaki, and all the speculations I've read about the Anunnaki, no one ever really told me what the Anunnaki meant. And it's very, very simple. The Anunnaki simply means the people of Anu. Anu is a god. They were his people. So it's either the people that follow Anu as a god or the people made by Anu. But I didn't know even that basic thing about who the Anunnaki were or what the Anunnaki meant. So it's nice to know that what it really means now. It's really nice to know what it really means. And that basic knowledge hasn't even been disseminated, at least in a way that I've heard it and been able to take it into consideration. Now, the first mention of the people of Anu or the Anunnaki was in Mesopotamia in cuneiform clay tablets several thousand years old. So think about this. The oldest writing that we have are these clay tablets, and they were very smart to use clay tablets because they stand up to to the test of time, the ravages of time. And you've seen the kind of angular marks that were used and put into these clay tablets when they're wet. Of course, they're dried, and they stay there. And, Brandon asking, what do they look like? What's the bird appearance represent? Afro talking about stay in the love. Sammy Zarillo talking about chakras. Are they an Anunnaki implant? Great questions. And this is a series, and we will get to that. Indika saying, I wonder if Christ was a time traveler. People giving naughty beaver shout outs. And nice to see you too, Spica, however you say that. But the traditional approach to all creation myths, not just the Anunnaki creation myth, but even the biblical creation myths, most of the skeptics tend to view them as really myths. Steady Eddie asking a good question. Were we the gold miners? Timothy asking, are the Anunnaki behind this shadow government? So yeah, these are all good questions. And I think that if we assign without consideration creation myths to the realm of fairy tales, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to understand. Hello to Jonathan in the PI, to understand and receive some helpful information. Because of course, all creation myths do have some myth involved in them, some untruth, some extrapolation, some hyperbole, some things that, just trying to make them, bigger than they are, because they are stories. And the best stories, hello, Ghost 3, the best stories are the best stories. And the reason why people remember them is because they're vibrant. They have a lot of detail and a lot of imagery. So if you're trying to keep a story spread and keep it going, well, then, hey, you do want to make it sometimes a little more fantastical than it really is. But the approach of this author, and my approach, is that we do consider that if not all, but most, if not all, at least most of the great creation myths are based on, or at least in part, on some fact. Especially when you look at all of the great creation myths, and as you read them from the oldest to the youngest, and by the way, the Hebrew Bible is among the latter, not the former. It's not one of the oldest, it's one of the youngest. And as you begin to see similarities, as you begin to see themes, as you begin to see things repeated over and over and over, you begin to realize that these people read what each other wrote. Especially the oldest ones got read, and I like to say that they were borrowed from copiously. And what that is wink, wink, plagiarized heavily. And folks, the Old Testament is a blatant ripoff of the Sumerian text. It just is. So there are fantastical implications in all of the creation myths, and there are factual implications. At least it's based on fact. It's like you watch TV and it says this story is based on actual events, but they've been changed to protect the innocent and make it a more entertaining product. They don't say that last part, but that's really what they're doing. But some of these creation myths do have a factual background, and so do the Anunnaki text. So do the Old Testament text. They do have some background in facts. Timothy Buddha asks, I've always told that men created religion to control the masses. Is that true? Well, yes, it is. Now, here's a question that the author asks. Are the Anunnaki really extraterrestrials? So let's look at that. Are the Anunnaki from Earth? No, they're not. If they're not from Earth, which is terrestrial, and they're from somewhere else, then by definition, they're extraterrestrial, aren't they? Let me take that a step further. In the beginning, the gods created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. If the gods came here to create the heavens and the earth, were they from here? No, they weren't, because it wasn't even created yet. So if the gods that came and created this heaven and this earth came here to create it, then they're not from here either, are they? What does that mean? That means that the Elohim, the gods that created this earth, were extraterrestrials, just by the definition of the term. And if the Word, or Jesus, Yeshua, Messiah, whatever you call him, was one of the Elohim, which you all believe if you're of the Christian leaning, then that means that Jesus was an extraterrestrial. He wasn't from here, ladies and gentlemen. So were the Anunnaki? Are the Anunnaki extraterrestrial? Of course they're extraterrestrials. They're not from here. Now, does that mean they fly around in spaceships or on planets? I don't know, but they are definitely extraterrestrial. And if you study the Mesopotamian texts, as I have, of course, not like these men that have written books about them, but I have read through the tablets, the Enuma Elish. I've read it. I've looked at it. I've studied it. And as this author says, I agree. You cannot find anything in the Babylonian text that contradicts the possibility that the Anunnaki are extraterrestrial. In fact, as you read it, you're convinced they are extraterrestrial, i.e. not from here, and maybe from some other place. And of course, if you're not from here, you're from another place. So there's that whole thing, ladies and gentlemen. But at the very least, we have to say that they're not from here. And if they're not from here, where are they from? There's got to be some other places, or as OMG, as Moses says, are you extraterrestrial if you're from Earth in another dimension? Wow. OMG. Now you've opened a whole new door and a whole new rabbit trail. But of course, it is very possible. And for some random reason, Ghost 3 says Walmart. Not sure why, but I thought it would be worth mentioning. And astronomy now estimates that there are trillions of planets in the cosmos. And, I'm a Bible college graduate. I'm not a math major, but now that's interesting. Sammy says Mork from Orc said Nanu Nanu. Sounds like Anu Anu. And of course, the Nanunnaki are led by Leak Project's Rex Bear. But at any rate, there's a trillion planets out there, ladies and gentlemen. And again, I'm a Bible college graduate. I'm not a math major, but what are the chances that of the trillions of planets, we're the only one that has life on it? Sentient life, sort of. What are the chances that this planet is the only planet that has life on it out of the trillions that are out there? I don't know. You can make that decision for yourself. And if there are inhabited planets out there, isn't it at least possible that there's other civilizations out there? Just something to think about, ladies and gentlemen. Just something to think about. And we'll press on here with a little bit more. The ancient Mesopotamian cultures that brought us the Anunnaki were the culture of Sumer. Life begins at Sumer. Many of you have read that book. Akkad. Babylonia. Many of you know about Babylon. Mr. Darty, can I ask your opinion on black people who believe they're the true Jews and Yahweh being their God? Well, you know, James, I thank you for that question. James Cuello. Can I ask your opinion about black people who believe they're the true Jews and Yahweh is their God? Well, I would just brush this off because it is not what we're talking about today. But James asked with great politeness and courtesy. And I get emails from people like this at least every other day, usually every day. And I'm going to try to be as thoughtful and as kind as I can be, James, in answering that question. And I don't know if you're an advocate of that position or not, but what do I believe about black people who believe they're the true Jews and that Yahweh is their God? I think they make the flat earthers look like rocket scientists. I think that's the stupidest, and I know you don't like me to say that word, most ludicrous, most idiotic, nonsensical foolhardiness that's ever come out from between human lips. That black people are the true Jews and that Yahweh's their God. That's the dumbest thing I think I've ever heard. And I hope I was kind and considerate in my response to that. So thank you for asking the question. And there you go. And Warrior Princess says they crazy. I agree with you, Warrior Princess. 110% is Spartan, O negative, and the ghetto conservative also come into the chat room. So Sumer, Babylonia, and Assyria. And folks, we're not talking about one or two clay tablets. We're talking about hundreds, even thousands of clay tablets that have been found and have been read and have been categorized. Now, some of them are busted up. Some of them are just fragments. Some of them have big pieces of them missing. But folks, and I'm not trying to upset you that are Christians, but there's a lot more of those clay tablets of the Babylonian, Mesopotamian scriptures than there is of the Old Testament. And they're way older, ladies and gentlemen, way older. So there's a lot of stuff to read, a lot of stuff to look at, a lot of stuff to study. So this whole Anunnaki thing has got way more verifiable textual evidence than this whole thing right here. And I'm not trying to make anybody mad. I'm just sharing with you the facts. Remember, I'm the mailman. Sometimes I bring you bills and you hate me. Sometimes I bring you checks and you love me. But among the most important texts that we get from these cultures is the Babylonian creation story called the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish is the creation story. It's written on 7 tablets. I've written all 7 of them. I think I've done broadcast on this channel about all 7 of them. And I hope I didn't lose James, who asked the question. I don't see him back in there. I hope I didn't upset him. But if you don't want an answer, don't ask me the question. Make sure that if you ask me a question, you really do want an answer. Most scholars have dated the Enuma Elish around 2000 BC. I think that's way too young. I think the Enuma Elish is much more ancient than 2,000 years ago, and lots of people are beginning to agree with me, or that's a new school of thought. And the remarkable thing, and we're going to start wrapping it up here, the remarkable thing about the Enuma Elish is that there's remarkable parallels to the Enuma Elish and to the books of the Old Testament, and very specifically the book of Genesis. If you read the book of Genesis and you read the Enuma Elish, hello to my youngest subscriber, Sophia, who's just arrived home from school. And if you look at the Old Testament and you look at the Enuma Elish, those brothers and I don't know if there's any sisters or not, but those brothers and sisters that wrote those books, they read each other. And I'm convinced that the Enuma Elish is much more ancient than the Old Testament. So I'm saying those Old Testament writers read the Enuma Elish, and they used a lot of the material they copiously borrowed, i.e., blatantly plagiarized from the Enuma Elish. And if we believe that these stories are at least partially based on true events, then what we read in the Old Testament is at least partially silliness in the chat room based on true events. The Enuma Elish talks about the goddess Tiamat. Many of you were waiting for Tiamat to make her appearance, and that she was the primordial mother of the race of gods. And oh, here we get to it. There's gods that created gods. So you've got a hierarchy of gods. There's gods, divine beings that were created by the Almighty God. So we've got the inexpressible ones. We've got the creator source God, or gods, I'm convinced, at least two. And then they created beings that would be called gods, like the Anunnaki, the Elohim. Are they the same? So Tiamat was the primordial goddess. Apsu was her male partner. And out of their union came this type of personified power of creation that they called Mumu. They mixed their energies, and then they created these other gods. So you got gods creating gods. Sounds like Psalm 82, when an Elohim stood in the council of the Elohim and talked to Elohim. So Tiamat, and what was dude's name again? Tiamat and Apsu used this thing called Mumu, and they created gods, divine beings. Gods, divine beings, people. Wow. Interesting stuff. And if you think about it, in the beginning, the Elohim created us. And the question becomes, who created the Elohim? Did someone? Is it possible that someone created the Elohim and that the Elohim weren't the top of the divine food chain? And if Jesus was an Elohim, which you have to believe if you have any consistency in your consideration of biblical scriptures, Jesus said he had a father. Jesus said he had a father. So if Jesus was an Elohim and he had a father above him, wow, it begins to sound a lot like the Enuma Elish. They created 3 generations of gods. The first one was Lamhu and Lahamu, out of which became Anshar and Kishat. And then the 3rd generation, interesting, it's the 3rd generation. Please do not turn our chat room into Tinder. A 3rd generation followed, and there was a god named Anu, Anunnaki. There was a god named Anu. He had 2 female mates, and they had sons called Enlil and Enki. Enlil means Lord of the Storm, and Enki means Lord of the Earth. And now we're down to the Anunnaki, who also had female companions, who also mysteriously have disappeared, like the females from the Old Testament divinity, which is another interesting correlation. And out of Enlil and Enki, sons of Anu, right? Anshar. Yes, sons of Anu, Enlil and Enki create a race of gods called the Anunnaki. Anunnaki. How about that? A race of gods called the Anunnaki. And then that's where it really gets interesting, because a lot of weird things start happening. Just to give you a little preview of our next transmission on this, all of a sudden, these gods get all upset. Big war and fights break out. And all of a sudden, you got an uprising, and things really get interesting from there. And I can't help but think how it parallels the activity between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. So the Anunnaki A to Z, that's the beginning right there, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back with much more in the days to come. And tonight, we're going to have and feature Sandra D and myself on the Serpent and Dove broadcast. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want real world advice from real people about relationships, about spirituality, you don't want to miss tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Serpent and Dove with the lovely Sandra D and myself. We have Derek Bros coming up with me for some more great shows, putting together a show with Rex Bear of Leak Project. Also on Sunday, we have Not Your Normal Sunday show with my good friend, R. Wayne Steiger. Every Monday, we have The Last Stand with Jay Campbell. And October 20th, folks, we've got Bob Sanders, and I missed your name, I'm sorry. We have Bob Sanders, who is the spokesperson for the Great White Brotherhood, making his first ever interview appearance on a special edition of The Last Stand. So, folks, great things happening, powerful things happening. And I want to thank you. The Divinity in me recognizes the Divinity in you. Namaste. I want to give you thanks for helping us blow past 24,000 on our way to 25 by the end of this month, I believe. And I want to thank you so much for your support. I want to thank you so much for your participation. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your opinions, and your questions here in the chat room. You do add so much to the show. That's why I try to mention and talk about and look at the questions on each and every broadcast. And I do hope that you will continue to ask questions. I hope that you will continue to question answers. I hope that you'll do the inside job, as Sandra says. It is an inside job to unindoctrinate yourself, to create yourself, and to build a life that you'll love. Because at the end of the day, whether there's Anunnaki, non-Anunnaki, or it's all a bunch of bull hockey, what about you? What are you going to do? And that's important. October 20th, Bob Sanders will be on. That's important because you and I, ladies and gentlemen, we're part of the last generation of real humans. And it's time for us to get busy.